The next basic movement, somewhat related to the back step, involves arching type of motion. This time the hip pop is front instead of back. And that's important in throws such as body locks. Also, it's important in terms of learning to lift your opponent correctly. And that is an important point that I'll go over in a moment. To begin with, the arch type movement with a throw, for example, with a body lock. And again, we'll be going over that in a future DVD in terms of the technique for the body lock and those type of throws. The principle, though, is pretty much the same as with the back step. This time, though, I want to pop with the lower part of my abdomen against my partner's abdomen, and I want to do the same thing as I did when I did the back step, popping his hip out. We're just facing in different directions. Instead of my back to my partner's abdomen, we're going to be chest to chest. And when we do any type of arching type throw, it's important to be thinking about that pop. And when you actually do a throw, for example, a body lock, it's important you don't think of it so much as having the person float over you. You're powering them with their hips, or you're powering them with your hips. So it's a very similar principle. And that's a very critical thing to have an understanding of if you want to be successful throwing body locks. Not so much having the partner, your opponent, float over you, but being able to pop him well with your hip. The first drill is simply to practice with a partner so that you get that notion of using your hips as well as arching back. And Colby's going to hold on to me carefully, and we're going to grab arms.
You want me to just roll? Or?
You don't need to go all the way down. Good. And notice how Colby pops his hips up when he does that. Boom. Good. One more time. Good. The arch is critical, but the hip pop is at least as critical. And most people, when they're practicing these type of techniques, especially those that have not had Greco-Roman type training, have a tendency to try to, when they throw, to float their partner or their opponent over them. The hip pop is critical, and it's important that you can really ingrain that concept in your mind for when you actually do this type of technique. And I'll show you a very practical example of that actually in a moment in a somewhat different situation. You can also do this type of drill by yourself. Hold it. Again, notice how Colby pops his hips up. He arches back, he looks back as well. He looks back and pops his hips up. Good. Now, the next thing for us to practice, and again, we're not going to go over the specific throw, is simply a drill where you practice popping with your hip. And I can just grab my opponent here, over one side, under the other. And he's got me under one side and over the other. It's opposite. We're over and under here. Now, my left foot is going to stand or step close to the inside of his left foot, and my right foot is going to follow up to the outside of his left foot, to this position here. Okay? I'm going to grab, boom, boom. Now, all I want to do from that position here is I want to practice the hip hop, and that's all, the only concept I want to get across. I'm going to grab up here. And I'm not arching so much as just hip hopping. Now I'm going to talk to you about using that abdominal pop in a lifting position. For example, when you've got a high double leg attack on your opponent. And I'm going to show you what I feel is the proper way to lift versus perhaps somewhat more improper or more inefficient type of ways of lifting. Again, this notion here with your hips is critical in terms of any type of throwing motion, and I think it's very important in lifting motions as well. For example, if I am in on a high double leg here and slightly off to the side, which is a common position when you get to your feet with a double leg, I can lift my opponent several different ways. There are three main ways, actually. The first way is probably the worst, and that is I'm around, I have the double leg, my back is down, and I lift up with my back. My back, obviously, does not involve my most powerful musculature. It's going to be hard to lift somebody that's good that way, especially if they're about my weight, or certainly if they're heavier. That would be a very inefficient or poor way of lifting. Most people, wrestlers or non-wrestlers, are quite familiar with that and avoiding that type of a mistake. Now, the other way of lifting, which is very common, is if I have my opponent in a double leg position, I squat, keep my hips low, my shoulders over my hip, and I do like a squat here. I use the power of my legs because my legs and my hips are much more powerful muscles or muscle groups than my lower back. And it makes some sense to be able to lift that way. Certainly I can lift a lot more like this than I can like that. Nonetheless, doing a squat requires a fair amount of energy. A more efficient way for me to lift, and using the same concept of the abdominal pop, is not to think about lifting up, but to think about lifting out. Because if I hit him out, his legs, likewise, are going to go out and up, and I will have lifted him. And if I can do that in a way where I have a lot of momentum, and that momentum helps him up, it's kind of like cheating when you're working out on a Nautilus machine or any type of weights. If you can kind of start it out fast and get momentum, you're actually burning off a lot less energy. And so this is an efficient way to lift somebody. I have a high double here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to step in and I'm going to do that hip pop. Boom. I'm not going to hold them up. I'm going to step and pop. And you'll notice I'm not lifting. I'm certainly not using my back, and I'm not even using my legs so much. I'm just whacking them with my hips. So I have them in tight here. I step. You'll notice when I do that, pop on my toes. Out will bring your opponent up. We'll go over finishes in the future, but you can be sure I'm not just going to hold somebody up. I don't want to hold somebody my own weight above my head. That takes a lot of energy. I'm going to let them down right away. We'll talk about those type of finishes more in the future. But right now, I'm just trying to get across the concept of how important it is to pop and to pop with throws, but also in terms of lifting your opponent. Drills to practice in terms of this arching type technique are, as you've seen a moment ago, you can practice the arch with your partner or with an opponent, grabbing his arm and arching back. That's a good way to start. The next way is to then go back on your own and practice that when you have confidence being able to go back that way on your own without having the support of your partner. Always either have your hands back behind your head. Never do a throw and strike your head. Your head does not hit the mat when you throw. That's critical, not just injury prevention-wise, which is, of course, very important, but also that's incorrect technique, which we'll get to when we get to the DVD on throwing. So when you practice by yourself, do not hit your head. Colby wasn't bashing his head. He was turning as he completed that arch back. Another way to practice is if you have one of those Greco-Roman wrestling dummies that I had talked about earlier. You can grab around them, and we don't have one here to actually demonstrate that, but those are excellent, excellent training devices. Grab around, pop, grab, pop, and just practice that. And then you practice with the arch. We'll be getting more into what you do actually when you do the throw in a future DVD. But that hip pop, that is critical, and you can practice that with one of those throwing dummies.